So Sean's son is skiing right now, so.
Oh, yeah. Vous la connaissez de nom.
Quand on était au G7, là, c'était
Ouais.
là-haut. À un moment donné, il y avait un cocktail là-dedans, même à côté du set. Là, on regardait avec le point d'interrogation qui était, je ne sais pas si vous connaissez ça, la municipale. Non, je suis contente de parler, c'était une grosse rencontre sur l'économie sociale, tu sais, mais on était juste un groupe de Montréal, c'était ça, qui était là.
Non, je ne serais pas là.
T'étais pas là? Ah, ben non, c'est ça. Est-ce qu'on a plus de personnes dans la
Oui, c'est bon, on peut commencer.
C'est bon. Donc, moi, on se met où, David et moi, pour qu'on se voit? C'est mieux.
Ouais, c'est mieux à gauche.
OK, David, would you like to come with me? C'est bon? Jonathan. Donc, bonjour à tous nos participants aux multi-conférences d'aujourd'hui en compagnie de David LePage. Donc, nous sommes dans le bureau de l'ECPAR. Il y a 6 ou 7 personnes sur place. Et bienvenue à tous ceux qui nous regardent en vidéoconférence, les membres de l'ECPAR et les autres invités là, pour cette présentation. Donc, je vais prendre, moi je suis Anne-Marie Saunier, directrice générale de l'ECPAR. Et notre invité aujourd'hui, David LePage, qui vient directement de la Colombie-Britannique, est un partenaire de l'ECPAR sur le dossier de l'achat social. Donc, l'ECPAR, on travaille les 3 dimensions du développement durable, comme on peut les introduire dans les pratiques d'acquisition, environnement, économique et aussi le volet social. On est bien connu pour ça. Et depuis 2 ans, on a la chance de collaborer avec un partenaire de Colombie-Britannique qui est en charge, au fond, d'un projet qui vise à renforcer l'économie sociale partout au Canada et les achats auprès du secteur économie sociale. Donc, David est vraiment, on peut dire, je vais le dire parce qu'il ne parle pas trop en français. He's not speaking really in French. You don't understand, and I'm going to say that you are really recognized for what you are doing in terms of social procurement. We can see your name everywhere at the UN, and you were explaining because you were in China, presenting what you are doing. Donc, David est vraiment une sommité en matière d'achat social. Donc, pour nous, à l'ECPAR, c'est vraiment une chance de pouvoir référer à quelqu'un au niveau pan-canadien qui peut nous aider à voir comment on peut continuer à travailler ce dossier-là, qui est un travail de tous les jours. Donc, David est en visite ici pour travailler avec le chantier d'économie sociale et nous, d'autres partenaires, sur ce dossier-là pour les prochaines années. On lui a demandé de présenter ce qu'eux appellent les communautés benefit agreements, qui est une façon particulière de travailler avec les entreprises d'économie sociale. J'ai vu la présentation que David va vous faire, donc il va vous parler d'achat social, la façon dont il visualise l'achat social et cette question-là des communautés benefit agreements. David va présenter en anglais, donc David is going to present in French. If you have some questions, si vous avez des questions, des moments où vous voulez qu'on intervienne, qu'on explique, David va arrêter régulièrement pour vérifier avec vous si vous voulez qu'on prenne la peine de faire certaines traductions. Une présentation d'une 40aine de minutes et après, on va aller aux questions, aux échanges, parce que le but, au fond, est là jusqu'à 2 heures, en principe, 1 heure et demie, 2 heures, pour pouvoir échanger, poser des questions. Ça va? So,
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Thank you, everyone. This is really an honor because when we work in Canada, our colleagues have always been so great from Quebec for sharing all the learnings, especially years of working with Canadian Economy Sociale and translating from French all of the learnings that have developed in Quebec. So it's very appreciated that we can try and do a bit of a favor back after taking so much material. And I think we won't go for 2 hours, but we have that time locked off. So I'll do this presentation probably 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for discussion with people online as well as the people here. And as Anne-Marie said, although my historic roots are from Quebec, my family left Quebec and moved to the U.S. in the 1800s. And growing up in the U.S., my grandmother was not allowed to speak French to us because you had to speak English in the United States. And so I lost that part of my heritage. But there is, we do have Quebec roots, so I'm glad to be home. So I'm gonna walk through this, and as we said, it's in English, but some of the terms are even in English, because I do this all the time, and Marie and I even say, what does that word mean? And we do this, so if it's a word that doesn't make sense even in English, or if it's a concept that we want to translate, we have enough bilingual here, we can figure out what the right word is so that we get the right context. So basically, it's really quite simple when we talk about social procurement. We're just basically saying we're already buying stuff. How do we get a social value out of what we're buying? And it sort of came about where we actually started working on this was about 18 years ago. I was working in the downtown east side in Vancouver. At the time, it was the poorest postal code in Canada. Now with gentrification, it's one of the poorest, but not the poorest. And we were doing employment training. We had a whole collaboration of people who were doing employment training for people with barriers and people returning to work. And we kept finding out that they wanted to work, but no one wanted to hire them. So the barrier wasn't the person looking for work, the barrier was in fact the employer. Because on their resume, if they had postal code B6A, they said, oh, you must be an addict, you must have problems, I don't want to hire you. And these are people who just wanted work. So we had a group of tech people, technology companies that said, look at, how can we help the downtown east side? This is an embarrassment for the city and it's bad for the people. And we sat down and we said, well, they're not going to hire any people with barriers, but the people that they buy stuff from are the people who actually do entry-level employment. So the office supply company that has a warehouse is going to employ entry-level people. The courier service, the flower shop, the catering company. So we went to the tech companies and we said, why don't you buy from companies, your suppliers, should all be suppliers who are willing to hire from the inner city. And they said, that's a good idea. And we'll actually give you some money to create the website to help us find the employees. So that was when we launched the first social purchasing portal in Vancouver. And the idea was the bigger companies that were buying things would buy from the companies that did entry-level employment, which would, instead of us worrying about how do we train people, we were worried about how do we get people to work. So it was really switching from the supply side of the social problem to creating a demand side solution. And we ran that for a number of years, but because it was all grant-based, it kind of and also there were not very many social enterprises on the supply side 15 years ago, and it weren't very, so it was too early in the thing. But that's where I sort of learned we had to switch the model to address some of these. Procurement was the answer, so we had to be able to create a system around it. So I think we're now emerging to that point where we're learning that. So I just want to today go through a bit about why we're doing social procurement, how it is we define it, and then we want to talk about community benefit agreements and what we're learning about community benefit agreements, especially in some of the English Canadian communities. So I think we all recognize why we're even in the room. Is there some really tough questions I'm trying to answer? I mean, no matter what we're doing in all of our efforts, private sector, government, and nonprofit, we still have all these really severe problems. We have social isolation, we still have people living in poverty across Canada. We have, environmental. So what we're trying to do is with social procurement is if we're looking at these really tough issues, is it possible to actually take the marketplace and use the existing marketplace to solve some of these problems? So rather than trying to just address the problem, can we use the trading of goods and services And what happens then is we start to look at buying things, not as a financial transaction, but actually as a means of changing community. So we look at it for the fact that historically, it's kind of interesting. I was just reading this morning on the BBC or CBC that in Brantford, Ontario, a few weeks ago, they found some quinoa seeds. And the quinoa seeds are thousands of years old, and they came from the area that we now call Tennessee. So they said, aha, the First Nations people were trading goods and services across areas. So this quinoa did not grow in what we call Ontario today. So they were trading. The same thing last year they found in British Columbia that people were growing shellfish for trading. And they found in Quebec stones and gems that come from what we call Mexico. So thousands of years ago, the First Nations communities realized that you want to have a healthy community, trade with each other. You have something of value that I don't have, so I might not in the West Coast, and you have something else. It happened when I was working with a Native American project in New Mexico a few years ago. This guy showed up with a great big gym bag. Everyone looked at me, oh, Sean, you must be like a big athlete. You got a big gym bag. He said, look at me, I don't go to the gym. And he said, what's in your bag? And he said, porcupine quills. And so I said, porcupine? He says, yeah, I'm from the Dakota Nation, and we have porcupines. But we don't have any of these beautiful stones that my brothers have in the Southwest. So I'm going to trade my porcupine quills for these. So really, this model of how we create community can be built on trading of goods and services. So the objective somehow in the last 500 years became best value for money rather than best value for community. So we're trying to change that language from looking at just economic capital to what we refer to as community capital. So if we're doing trading of goods and services, how do we use it to build community capital? So everything from human capital, so people are learning skills, sharing skills, cultural capital, so important in Canada, recognizing cultural diversity and growing it, physical capital, the environment, the natural things, and also I think the glue, the social capital, because I think, it's quite fascinating that the social isolation is becoming such a predominant issue. And so how do we use procurement to actually build community capital as opposed to merely building economic capital? The economic capital is part of it, but we've got to focus from it being the only consideration to one consideration in the entire process. And when we look at community capital, it's not so much about being prescriptive in procurement, but being more descriptive, because we find that in different communities, different needs have to be met, right? So it could be anything from, for some communities, it's employment opportunities. In other communities, we're working with some rural communities. It's all about how do we get jobs for youth so they don't leave our rural communities. In Vancouver, it's really a lot about poverty reduction in the inner city, because it's such a predominant. In others, it might be about the cultural diversity. So rather than saying we have an answer in social procurement, it's really about providing communities with the power to define what it is that's going to create a healthy community. So everybody, I think, understands the basics of procurement. Somebody buys something, somebody supplies it, and that creates an economic value, primarily for the supplier. Because if you're going to buy something from the city, and then you say, I'm going to pay you for that, and they get the money, so it's an economic transaction mostly. What we're trying to say is that procurement is not a single transaction. It actually has multiple outcomes, and it actually can maximize the financial value. So rather than just financial value, flip that around and say, how do we take the financial value to create greater value? Joanne Barracat from Australia is an academic there and wrote a great book a couple of years ago on the new government models and how procurement fits with that. So how governments are now trying to be more engaged with the community and more stakeholder engagement, that procurement actually can move with that and be a really powerful tool to help government understand as they're relating to community, procurement is a really valuable tool in enhancing that relationship. So she talks about it as actually a strategic model. So when governments or private sector are trying to achieve things, that procurement is part of the model or the means to achieve them. It's not just purchasing. So it's trying to integrate procurement into a whole strategy. So for government, most governments, we look at whether it's the SDGs that are put out by the United Nations that many governments are now saying, well, we're going to help build and solve and address the SDGs. It's fascinating to watch how different communities take different pieces of that and say we're going to be doing that. There's actually a rural community that we're working with in British Columbia. We've been with a water treatment process. In the water treatment process, they are engaged with some of the First Nations communities because it's on their property as well. So they're using the procurement of that water treatment process to actually build the relationship that they're trying to do with First Nations in their community after years of animosity and divisiveness. They're actually using the procurement process to recreate that relationship, which is part of their community strategy.
David, just wait a minute. I think we're going to see if everybody is okay in line, because I think maybe there's a problem with the sound. Est-ce qu'il y a un problème avec le son?
Oui, j'approcherai la table en fait parce que je pense que le son il
On peut
capté
prendre
sur
le
mon
temps,
ordinateur.
donc
mais-
permettez-nous, we will just repeat because I think there is some problem. People are not understanding very well. So. Est-ce qu'on peut
Ça
approcher
pas
la
toi,
table,
non. Ça pas toi. Non, ça pas toi parce qu'il y a le changement. Si tu permets, Jean, je vais mettre mon ordinateur.
Pardon? C'est bon? On y va comme ça? OK. Est-ce qu'il n'y avait pas de questions, Jonathan? Ou est-ce que tu peux voir s'il y a des questions?
Pas de question.
No pas de questions. Donc, we have no question, and I think it's going to be better with the sound.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I will try to stand more this way.
I think, let me see.
Yeah, the actual problem is that the sound was being taken from my computer, either from the speaker. So by getting my computer closer to you, I hope we get a better sound.
Okay.
You are okay for the, it's okay.
Okay.
Well, it should be okay. Just try to speak louder, maybe.
Okay.
Thank you, David.
That is my problem. I always tell people when there's groups, don't be afraid to do this because I have a tendency to bounce. So I will try as well to project better. So when we talk about moving traditional procurement to social procurement, it really is still the purchaser trying to create the value they need for what they're buying. So they're buying, whatever of goods or services. They're still going out to potentially do competitive bidding. So they're looking for someone who's going to provide the service. And they also then, though, are adding the social value. So what happens, instead of it only being this economic transaction, with the addition of the social value, we actually, as a result, create community value. So it's the same purchase, potentially the same supplier, but with an added value into it, so that we actually have created some community value, not just economic value. And it's great, like working with Anne-Marie and ECPAR because of your tradition of working with the environmental side of things, and as we've come into this, I don't have that environmental background. I've always been more on the social side of things, and friends and others were like, oh, come on over to the environment. Now I'm actually learning more about it as I do this. But what we're learning a lot is that until about 1960 or so, all procurement really became just this, give me the lowest price, but meet my quality. And that was it. And then in 1969, the river in Cleveland got on fire. And some of us are old enough to remember what a tragedy it was when a river started to burn. Someone said, I think we have an ecological problem. But and everyone was saying it's not a good idea to put all those effluents into the river. I mean, like, stop doing that. And everybody said, what's the problem? Well, when the river got on fire, people said, I guess we got a problem. And when the eagles across North America started to die because of DDT in all the, ground, people started to say, well, we got a problem. So in the 60s, people started to say, if we're going to buy stuff from you, you got to have some environmental concerns about it. One of the procurement people I work a lot with, Larry Berglund, used to be the director of procurement in the city of Vancouver and then at University of British Columbia. Larry went to, he calls it procurement school in the 1970s. And he said he raised his hand and he said, so professor, what's this deal about all this environment and green stuff? And the professor said, don't worry, Larry, it's just a fad. So it wasn't a fad. It became integrated, and I think organizations like ECPAR and others helped integrate it into the procurement. So people started to realize if I'm buying things, one, I cannot buy things that are going to damage the environment. And then it grew further to say, I'm going to buy things that actually contribute to a healthy planet. What we're doing now with social is the same kind of incremental process of saying, okay, we can buy price, quality, and green. We can now buy price, quality, green, and social, and enhance that existing thing. The good part is that we're learning a lot about how this evolved in terms of it, and it's also for procurement people, they're starting to understand it's a very similar process. And a colleague from the federal government said that they were on a conference call and one of their colleagues said, I have no idea how to measure this social stuff. How could we ever do social procurement? I don't know how to measure it. And then she said to this other person, so you and I have been around for a while. 20 years ago, did you know how to measure the green stuff? I said, no. Well, did we learn? Yes. So I think what we're learning is we don't have all the answers right now on the social procurement, but we are learning and we're evolving it. And I think that's why the partnerships that we're trying to create become so important. The marketplace, all these things become part of the ecosystem for social procurement, but it is evolving just like the environmental side. So one of the big questions that everyone asks, especially if they buy for government, is it legal? Because you have how many trade agreements? Lots of trade agreements. And now we have a new trade agreement, the USMCA, sounds like a song from the 70s, right? And then now I just read yesterday the Democrats are going to try to reopen it now that they're in the House. So it always comes up with whether or not the trade agreement stops social procurement. And it doesn't. It puts some parameters on how we have to do bidding. What it means is we cannot exclude anyone from bidding. We can't say you have only local people can bid or only social enterprises can bid. But it does allow us to do things like ask for community outcomes regardless of who wins the contract. So we can't do things like say, what's going to be the local economic impact of you getting this contract? We're not saying you have to be local to get it, we're just saying you have to contribute to the local economy, so it's not exclusive. The other thing that the trade agreements have, which is really fascinating, is exceptions. And every trade agreement that, and I've already read the USMCA one, it's in there as well, there is a very old exception that is in every trade agreement which exempts purchases from nonprofits, charities, businesses that hire people with disabilities, and labor prison. So somehow, when trade agreements were originally designed in the 80s, there was a concern that we did not exclude these businesses that governments wanted to buy from to create social outcomes. So an exception was put in there. Part of it, I think, because governments used to use, maybe they still do, prison labor for products, so they excluded that. Nonprofits, they said that's okay. Businesses that hired people with disabilities, because in the US, that was a lot of sheltered workshops were funded by government contracts. And it really hurt the image of it, but it was a reality. So those are all exempt, and I'll give you some examples of how that's used. And then the other exemption is the thresholds. So this year's 10,000, where you don't need to go to bid? Oh, okay. So most municipalities, it's either 10 or 25,000. Provinces are different. The federal government is 25,000. Under 25,000, they don't have to go to bid. They can just call you up and say, "You want to do this work for us?" 75,000, they can choose 3 bidders who can bid on it. Over that, they have to open it up. But what it allows is when we started to look at what the federal government buys, there are not many breakfasts or lunches that cost more than $25,000. So in terms of catering, it really opened up a lot of opportunities when they said, oh, we don't have to go to that guy. We can call a social enterprise up without creating any problem. So the thresholds become important, the exemptions become important, and the criteria on which we weight the bids becomes important. So we break social procurement into 2 streams when we talk about it. One is the social purchasing, so that's the buying of goods and services. The other one is community benefit agreements, and that's the benefit that can be created when there's a major infrastructure or development project. So we kind of broken them up because the tools and the methods that we're using are different. And especially in working with government, the tools and the leverage that they have are different when it's from buying something for 2 or 3 years versus a major infrastructure. With goods and services, I think this is starting to become pretty good practice now, is people are adjusting the weighting on what they're looking for. So price, quality, environment, and social, depending upon what they're buying, the weighting for the social can be higher. So as an example, Simon Fraser University does a lot of catering for all their campuses, food services, and it used to just be one contract. And whoever won that contract at lowest price and met the environmental part, they got all the work. Well, then some of their customers and their students started to say, well, we'd like some social enterprises, and we would like some Aboriginal choices, and we want to be more involved in the community. So they are changing their evaluation in their next contract to say, you have to be big enough to handle everything, but you have to subcontract to some social enterprises and Aboriginal businesses for particular events. So they're changing the weighting for those big companies who are bidding to see how inclusive they can be in their supply chain. And it really was on a demand base from their students and their meeting users. It also changes on what type of thing, like the same thing if you took Simon Fraser University, if they're buying things for the lab, it's going to be very tight quality and price. There's not going to be as much on the social and environmental. But when you get to things like catering, couriers, landscaping, all of those types of businesses, there's a lot more room we found for social value to be created. Manitoba housing, this is one of the things we found is the Crown corporations responsible for social housing have been the most progressive users of social procurement because they have realized that putting people in social housing is one aspect of addressing the needs of those low-income community members, but it doesn't help them get a job, it doesn't help them create income, it doesn't help them move out if they have the potential. So Manitoba Housing in Winnipeg started working with an inner city group called Build that does retrofits of all their apartments. And so they were doing construction training and they work with youth, and it's always a joke because to get into their program, you cannot have a high school degree, you cannot have a driver's license, and you have to have a prison record. If you meet all that criteria, then you're welcome. If you don't, then somebody else will take you. So they take really the hardcore kind of youth, and then they were training them, and then they put. So Manitoba Housing started to like say, okay, well, you can pick some of our apartments up, we'll give you a little work, a handshake deal. But as they progressed, it was really interesting. What they found out is these guys could do the whole retrofit. And then they created a subsidiary nonprofit that hired the people from Build to actually do the contracting with Manitoba Housing. And Manitoba Housing used the nonprofit exemption to say, you can do all this work for us. And they've created a system now that is so efficient that if someone moves out of an apartment, Manitoba Housing walks in with an iPad and checks off everything that needs to be fixed. There's a fixed price on it. They send that to the procurement people, and the procurement people check it, approve it, and send it the next day to Build to do the work. It takes them 48 hours to turn around a contract, as opposed to what used to be 3 months of someone going in and inspecting, writing up a report, giving it to procurement, who then had to write up a request for proposals, who then had to get the bids, who then had to evaluate them. So what used to be like this huge, costly process is now down to 48 hours in an iPad. And it gives the social enterprise regular work, because they're not having to bid, et cetera. They can actually have. So it's worked really well. It took political leadership because it was a minister at one point who stepped in and said, let's make this work. And just told the public servants this will work. And they said, we don't know how. He said, I'm the minister, you're the public servant, they're the community, let's make this work. And then they've now worked on it for several years, really successfully. And a couple of years ago, they did their social return on investment analysis with an outside, and it's $2.23 of value for the government for every dollar they give to this contract. Because of less healthcare use, less prison, less all the care that people used to have to get, the same people now are saving the government money for over twice the value of the contracts. In Ottawa, similar kind of thing. It was around landscaping, and Ottawa Housing started to work with a social enterprise and said, well, let's do a pilot, and they did a pilot. And then they said, okay, now we have to go out to bid. And when they went out to bid for the whole project, the social enterprise, because of their experience in the pilot, was able to compete and won the contract. So it really was Ottawa Housing helping to actually incubate the capacity for a smaller social enterprise to grow up to be the right size. In BC, housing on British Columbia, they actually, in every request for proposal they put out, there's a sustainable procurement area And in the sustainable procurement area, they put in their environmental requirements, but they also put in a social responsible practices requirement in every RFP, which has opened up the door for social enterprises that can meet both the environment, the price, the quality, and the social. They have all kinds of opportunities. And so their RFP language has actually promoted the opportunities for social enterprises, from everything like junk removal to, fixing things to whatever. It's really been a way that they can use their dollars to serve the thing. In Toronto, Toronto Housing has a policy that they can give you direct contracting if you're a nonprofit and more than half of your employees are Toronto Housing residents. So there's a new social enterprise building up that's getting all kinds of work from Toronto Housing because they're meeting the criteria of actually employing people from social housing. So the benefits of spending that money just are exponentially increased. Community benefit agreements are the way that we take major developments and infrastructure and create community value. Probably the oldest discussed community benefit agreement was from Los Angeles when they built the Staples Arena some years ago. They went and it was going to be built in an inner city neighborhood, and they said, well, you got to do something for the neighborhood. And they went to the neighborhood and they said, so what do you guys want? We're going to build a basketball arena and we're supposed to do something. And the community said, give us a daycare center. And they said, no, we're building a basketball arena. They said, we need a daycare center. Because if you're going to hire anyone from this community, they're not going to get to work unless they have a daycare center. So let's look at what we really need is we don't just need construction jobs, or we don't need jobs selling things at the stadium. We can't unless we have daycare. So they were one of the first communities to kind of hold up the development until they could negotiate what the community wanted. So community benefit agreements are recognizing that any major development or infrastructure is going to have an impact. It's going to have an economic impact, it's going to have an environmental impact, and it's going to have a social impact. Whether it's a road going through or whether it's a new high-rise, there are ripple effects economically, socially, and environmentally. So how do we take those ripple effects and direct them? So what we've looked at is the process that really requires stakeholder engagement, because it requires that the city who is giving permits or the province who's entering into a contract, the community that's going to be affected, and the developer sit down together and say, here's what we're trying to do. And negotiate out an implementation process that is involved in the design, the construction, but also the operation of the institution or of the place. And so then there's implementation process and then evaluation reporting. Because one of the pieces we've realized that unless there's some evaluation, it's just to be a contract. As an example, in Vancouver, when they built the new stadium, whatever, BC place, the developer said, okay, I'll hire 40 people from the downtown east side. And the city said, oh, good, okay, you get extra points for that. Well, within 3 months, because there was no measurement to that, within 3 months, all those workers were gone. Because they didn't work out. And so what we've learned, there has to be evaluation as well. A big breakthrough, Vancouver has an interesting history of community benefit agreements, BC place, but then when the Olympics came, the Winter Olympics in 2010, they were going to be the sustainable games. So they hired all these sustainable procurement consultants who were all from the environmental side. And then I would go to meetings and they'd say, we're talking about sustainability. And they'd go, green, 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 green. I go, social, green. And so it wasn't like a big piece, right? And so I always laugh because during the Olympics, they did a dinner for all the sustainable procurement efforts. And they took us all out to this nice dinner and da-da-da-da. And it was all environment except me. And the wins we got were tiny, but we really did influence the discussion at the gates. So things we got were the flowers that every competitor got when they got a medal. The flowers were made by a social enterprise training women coming out of prison to work in the florist industry. And it was because in the RFP, someone had put, there will be a social value. So a commercial florist found the social enterprise that trained the women in the thing, partnered, and won the bid. But the other big contract we got was the lost and found. But, which we thought was kind of funny, but ended up being very valuable because you got to keep everything that was lost and not found. So the inner city. So, but what happened is the city learned from that. They also, when they built the Olympic housing, they put a community benefit agreement on local hiring and local purchasing because it was in the inner city. And then when the casino in Vancouver wanted to grow from a little casino to a great big casino, the community members around there said, we don't want a bigger casino. Well, then the casino said, well, we'll do good things and we're a good company. So there was a negotiated community benefit agreement between the city and the developers of the casino. And it was quite fascinating because the issue became, how do you enforce it? Right? Because the previous casino had an agreement, and the penalty was a $50,000 bond. That if they didn't hire the right people or buy from the inner city, they had to pay a $50,000 bond. So as soon as they were not doing as well as they thought, the first thing they did was write a check for $50,000. So they did not have to adhere to any of the social components of their contract anymore. So the city hired me to help them with this new casino thing, and we're sitting in the room, and I said, well, just tag it onto their development permit. And they said, what? I said, they can't do anything without a development permit or an occupancy permit. And what cities have is the right to issue permits. I said, put it on their permit. You should have seen the great discussion between the planning staff and the social staff at the city. Because the planning staff was all like, hey, they're ready to dig tomorrow. And the social staff is, they haven't signed the agreement yet. And so there was interesting learning because and we said that they had to hire an outside monitor. And so I said, and the casino people came back and said, oh, we'll report. We're really good at reporting. We're a really good company. And the people from the city said, is that okay, David? I said, would you hire the Fox to report on the hen house and how things are going? And said, oh, good point. You have to hire an outside person too. So it was an interesting learning because that casino, the Park Casino, was built and they went over all their requirements. They had more than 10% of their employees doing construction were from the inner city. They used social enterprises like Embers for day labor. They used other social enterprises. And they did purchasing almost at 10%. Construction purchasing was more difficult because they used cement. We don't have a social enterprise that does cement yet. And so, but they did well. And that community benefit agreement also is not just construction, it was for the length of the casino. So as long as the casino was there, their occupancy permit actually has a community benefit agreement attached to it. So their employees now are up to about 17% from the inner city. And because of gentrification, we're now trying to work out not address only. 15 years ago, the zip postal code was pretty evident. You were low income. Now you could live in a $3 million condo and be in that postal code. So we've got to work on that. But they're buying a lot of stuff from the inner city providers, so social enterprises, locally owned businesses, Aboriginal businesses. So the process is working. we had a meeting maybe 6 months ago when they were finishing up and starting to open with them and with the city and the community, and I turned to the CEO of the casino and I said, so John, if you didn't have this community benefit agreement hanging over your head, would you have done any of this? They said, no. We would have bought for the lowest price from all of our friends. I said, glad we did this. But he recognized that in their business model, it was always lowest price from our friends, because that was easier, etc. Now they're very, very proud, and they brag, and they make presentations about how great they got. They also influenced a major construction company, Ellis Don, to learn how to do community benefit agreements, because they were responsible. And the guy from Ellis Don said, I figured this stuff out. And someone said, well, how did you do that? He said, well, they asked me like how many people work for social enterprises. And it's pretty easy. You count. 1, 2, 3. Okay, done. That week. And because everyone thought it was so complex, right? We didn't ask them to solve poverty. We just said, how many of your subcontractors are from this postal code? Well, if you're a legitimate business, you have an accounts payable and you know what postal code you spent the money in. This is not complex. This is reporting. So if we're really working together, we're able to make it work for everybody quite successfully. In public development, the Port of Vancouver is being redeveloped, a bazillion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar contract. And they put in a social component into the request for proposals. And so at the end, there were 3 finalists who were qualified, and they all had to put in their final bid. We had meetings with the biggest construction companies in the world as they were going like, what is the social part here? They had, and it was interesting because no one quite knew, but these big companies were forced to try to figure out what does that mean to have some social value for the neighborhood in which you're going to be working for the next 5 to 10 years. So it created different relationships, etc. But it was the contract from the Port Authority with that little bit of consideration that changed the behavior of those big construction companies. In October of last year, the City of Vancouver actually passed a community benefit agreement policy. So basically, what they have said is any major construction, any major development that comes to the city for rezoning, if it's over 484,000 square feet, it has to comply with the community benefit agreement of local employment and local procurement. So when we look at that, it didn't meet all the things that we wanted, but they negotiated with developers and with us, and we tried to get in the same room, but that's not how the government works. It's like, talk to you, here's the answer. But it's really a great initiative and first step, because now it opens the door. There's a gigantic hospital that's going to be built right next to the downtown east side. It's going to have huge ripple effects. The community now has a tool. And so we wrote to the mayor and council members 2 weeks ago and said, St. Paul's just applied for rezoning. Are we correct that that means we can now enter into a community benefit agreement discussion? And of course, public service is like, you didn't ask permission to write that letter. I said, oh, we thought we were just complying with the policy. So we now have a tool in the community that can say, if you're gonna have a gigantic building or a gigantic project, you have to work with the community to discuss the benefits to be created. And it's not just during the construction, but it will be the relationship or the jobs and the procurement of that hospital throughout the life of the hospital. So it's 50 years of benefits being created for local employment and local purchasing. One of the things that's now affecting everybody, every municipality and every province, is last summer, Infrastructure Canada, which is going to spend $180 billion in the next 10 years, signed agreements with every province. So they said in the next 10 years, $7 billion is going to come to Quebec for their share of the infrastructure. The agreement they signed was that in order to get that money, the province has to have a benefit agreement approved. So you cannot get the federal money without a community benefit agreement or a labor employment agreement or a local procurement agreement in place. And if the province wants to get out of that, then they have to have a good excuse, and that good excuse is publicly posted as to why they didn't enter into a community benefit agreement for that project. So it's interesting because there's two thresholds. One is 10 million, the other is 25 million. You guys are great in Quebec, you got the $10 million threshold. And most big projects are well over 10 million if you're doing a big road or a big federal building or something. So it requires them, the province. We've already had inquiries from some of the municipalities who are applying for federal money to say, what does this mean? So I think it's a great opportunity for us to engage with municipalities, provincial governments, and federal government to say, what does this mean? Because no one's quite sure what the implementation will be. We've met with Infrastructure Canada, and they say, yes, this is our objective, but we still have to work out what it means. But it's on the applications now that says, if you want to do this, what are you doing about that? So I think it's a great opportunity. Again, we're still at this developing stage, but it's a great tool now that we have for negotiating. We've actually started to create a community benefit agreement scorecard. If you know, and this is another learning from the environmental groups, they started to create lead qualifications. So you get so many points and you're lead this and so on. So we thought, can't really be prescriptive to every community what a community benefit should be, because for some it may not be employment, some it may be trades training for youth, for someone else it might be parks or whatever it could be. We try to create a scorecard that allows government, the private sector, and community to work together to say, what do we want to get out of this, and how do the points add up across the whole spectrum? So we had a graduate student from public policy at Simon Fraser University spend like 6 months or so just trying to create a scorecard, a gigantic spreadsheet that can be used for negotiating these agreements and measuring their outcomes. And so it can be used in the negotiation, it can be used in tracking, and it can be used in evaluation. And so it basically helps the groups identify what are the opportunities in this type of project. Is it like when we think about the hospital that's being built, we say, well, there'll be some jobs during construction, but boy, in a hospital, there's like coffee kiosks, and there's laundry, and there's food service. What are the opportunities in this particular thing? It's going to be totally different than the building of a viaduct or the rebuilding, different jobs, etc. So what are the opportunities? How can we negotiate the outcomes and the budgets? And how can we create some common language on what we're going to measure? Because that's always one of the problems, is the builders have a different set of language, government has different objectives, and community may have different objectives. What can we negotiate to be the common language in terms of success and measurement? So it's really a tool with a bunch of worksheets created that you can plug in, and the worksheets then like create values and then you can say, well, this is worth this much, you can weight it, so that it really becomes a tool on the table. So it's not like me versus you, it's like we're working on a common, trying to create a tool that creates a negotiating platform that creates these different scores, so that we can kind of start to build over the next 5 to 10 years, like the lead kind of evaluation. So we can say, then the city has agreed, the city of Vancouver, to work with us, we will say, well, when a building is this, it has to score this many points. And then we can start to look at like those certifications. Oh, this project is CBA gold. This one is silver, and be able to look at points. The other thing is we've produced a lot of these slides are from our guide. And I just found out this morning the funding is approved for translation. So I got that message at like 9:15. At 9:18, I sent the contract back to the translator and designer and said, now you can go ahead and translate the guide. And then our next project will be to translate the scorecard. So we're trying to make these as available. They're free online, but right now only in English. But hopefully in a couple of weeks, the French will be done, and at our summit in February, we'll have print material. So there's some barriers to this, and I think part of it has been the silos in government, where one side is trying to do social, like I said, and the other is trying to do development. So one's pro-development and one's pro-community, and how do we work together? I think there's been a culture of buying is money, and so how money, the cheapest is the best, not the best value. So really getting outside of a budget-only focus. So I think these are pretty common across purchasing, both environmental 20 or 30 years ago and now social. It's really not just a mechanical change, it's a cultural change. We're really talking about some cultural change in procurement. But what we're finding is when people start to look at procurement from a healthy community perspective, then it's not a big barrier because every municipality we work with, every province and the federal government all have strategies of social goals. They all say, we want to do this, we want to eliminate poverty, we want to create jobs for youth, we want to have better inclusion. So they have a goal. So how do we start to use procurement to achieve those goals? So rather than saying we do procurement over here, we do social development over here, it's like, how do we bring those together into a common community value creation model? So this is where working with organizations, we start with what are you trying to achieve? What do you buy? And how what you buy can it help you achieve your mission? And normally those are different pieces in an organization. And we're trying to say no longer are those different. They really have to be integrated, whether you're a nonprofit organization, a private company, or government. It's like you cannot escape having your mission. We're working with a construction company right now that really wants to be socially responsible. And they realize, wow, if we want to be socially responsible, it's not just writing checks to charities. It's where do we buy our stuff, who do we hire, etc. So they're really starting to look at their supply chain and their employment practices because they want it to be integrated, not a separate entity. There's lots of movement going on with policies and practices on the government side. We know really well in Quebec what we're doing with the city, with the pilots, the social enterprise, and what's going on with Chantier, and the whole social economy policy in the province, so lots of opportunities. Some municipalities, like in Alberta, Calgary just in December passed the social procurement policy and a 3-year implementation strategy. And working with them, they said, well, Toronto and Vancouver has policies. And I said, right, everyone expects Toronto and Vancouver to have policies like this. But when Calgary has a social purchasing policy, people are going to step up. Wow, this is a new one. So I think we're moving outside of the suspects into a whole new range of private sector people and municipalities trying to recognize how can they increase their social purchasing. Internationally, this is really becoming a pretty common theme. In the United Kingdom, They have the Social Value Act that they passed about 4 or 5 years ago, which they just did an assessment of last year and said it's not working as good, so they're now going back and looking at how do you revise it to make it more effective. In Scotland, they actually have community benefits in all public procurement, which meant a lot of training for staff, and a lot of what they did when they had a whole program funded by government called Ready for Business, where they brought the procurement people, the suppliers, and the community together and said, how do we work together, building new relationships. And in Australia, the state of Victoria has a really fascinating social procurement framework with lots of online tools and lots of engagement. Really took a serious step of making it happen. So I think what we're really talking about is, if we look at where we're moving from risk aversion to actually opportunity creation. And we're moving away from price and quality to price, quality, environment, and social. So as we evolve. And I think the biggest piece is we're moving away from it being a transaction. And then we said, well, it should be something more than transaction. We should be nice, you should be ethical. I think we're now looking at how do we actually use procurement to be transformative? Because when we think about the federal government spending $20 billion a year buying goods and services, what could they do with that, right? So right now there's Bill 344, probably hopefully getting out of the Senate in March, which will allow the minister to put a social value on construction and all those types of things. There's the agreements with the provinces, but I think we're also seeing that nonprofits and others who are spending money have starting to look at, well, where am I buying that? Am I just walking over to make it convenient, or am I helping create a social enterprise? Everything from what happens then is, as the demand grows, the supply is going to meet it. We're already seeing that when someone says, oh, you could build this, like in Ottawa housing, here's a pilot. 3 years later, here's the whole contract. So the demand side of the market is really the opportunity to create the transformative outcomes. And so we're basically, we're looking at a new governance model that basically says this is about community building. And everything we do has to contribute to how we build healthy communities. I think that's what we're all trying to do. Regardless of what sector we're working in, we're trying to build healthy communities. And I think the private sector is getting away from saying this is just an extraction of wealth to how do we contribute. The community is saying, how do we build healthy communities? And government is saying, how do we contribute? So if we can figure that out and move to the next step, I think it's only good. So. Questions?
Thank you, David. There's a lot of information, really interesting. Does somebody else have a question? Est-ce que quelqu'un a des questions?
Very clear.
En ligne, est-ce que... But David, would you explain to us maybe more in details what are the conditions to get a community benefit agreement? So I mean, you have a slide you were indicating that we need the stakeholder engagement. But is it necessary to get the stakeholder asking for it? Or you are talking about the regulation, it's one point. But I don't see that in Quebec we're going to have some real orientation on that now. So what are the conditions if the town of Montreal is beginning a project? Should we talk with the community to ask for that?
Yeah, so what's happening actually in Toronto, they're actually creating community benefit networks in the neighborhoods. So like Parkdale has a community benefit network that comes out of their community economic development group. So they're based in the community and they said, we have all these things that are going to happen. The community is being gentrified, it's changing. So the community is saying, we want to have some control or some participation in how the community builds. So they've created a community benefit network. Hamilton, the same thing. So there's a lot of communities that are working on their own to create the leverage they need. It's, back to the 60s and 70s and 80s of, where did Chantier come from, right? Chantier came from the community saying, we've got to get together to change what's going on. So there's some activity that's actually coming from the community. There's also some of the municipalities are actually recognizing that the developers really don't care about what happens when they're done. They're very concerned about change the zoning for me, make it as high as I can, maximize my profits, and then I'm going away because I don't even live in Vancouver, or I don't live in Winnipeg, I just want to build this. And they're going, wait a minute, we're going to have the ramifications of this for the next 50 years. So some municipalities are starting to ask the question, what are you creating? So a lot of municipalities have what are called community amenity agreements. So they get paid and they get a park or they get art or something. We're going, those are nice things. And the cities like them because it's tax revenue, but it's not really the community benefit. It's really like negotiated just with government and the developer. We're saying the difference is community benefit agreement asks the community, what do you need? And then that's where the evolution is. So, that's why the policy in Vancouver was important, because even though it's much higher than what we recommended to come into play, it at least forces the developer at a certain size to say, okay, community, we will sit down with you, because they have to. And as we know, that's the first step in changing things, is some kind of hammer.
Regulation.
Or I call it, it's a great big carrot. And you can either get a big reward or it's gonna hit you on the head. And so you can take the carrot and so it's sort of like, if they're good at it, they'll work really well. If they're resistant, then there's gonna be a harder time, right? So it also then requires the community to work together, right? So there's a community building piece of this as well, which I think is really important. Because again, we're taking that event and trying to create it into something that helps the community. So the community even getting together to talk about what they're doing. So in Toronto, the Parkdale community, having all kinds of community consultations to say, what is it we need? Is bringing the community together. So when they go to the negotiating table, they say, okay, we had all these community meetings. So I think it's really a valuable tool from a lot of different perspectives.
And the examples you have been giving from BC, so they all are on your site, I think, for the casino, and we can have the agreement, the CPA model agreement, everything is on the site.
And the other place to look is on our website, we just put up the Parkdale. So in Toronto, they just in December published a whole, I don't know what they call it, but basically the things they want to see for their neighborhood. So they spent a year in their neighborhood talking to people and then came up with almost a manifesto saying, if you're going to be in our neighborhood, here's what we want to see. So they started from the neighborhood side, which is pretty significant. In Toronto, there's some major infrastructure things like light rail, metro links, big water diversion thing. All of them have community benefit agreements attached. Most of them are around jobs.
Oh, yes.
So, and that's the Toronto issue, was more jobs, more well-paying jobs. So,
C'est ça que tu as vu, t'as eu une présentation des gens de la ville de
Yeah, that's what we saw.
un peu, pour voir comment ça déboule dans la ville de Toronto un peu, et on a quelqu'un de la ville de Montréal, peut-être un petit peu.
Well, what I saw is that the city of Toronto was very, from the top to bottom, implicated in a process where they included social enterprises and even proposed social enterprise to modify their business model to accommodate for a contract that they could get. And some of them did it, For example, there was one small contractor, he installed toilets, and the lady said, well, we don't need anybody to install toilets, but we need somebody to wash windows. We're opening 25 metro stations, so there's dust everywhere. Can you do that? He said, yeah. And they got a $200,000 contract. So they were very open about the way of doing business. And I think their criteria were much more flexible than what we see here. And they adapted to a reality of a social enterprise. Of course, that's not all of them who can do that. But just that example for me was so, how can I say, invigorating for the social economy and where it could go if we had that in a number of municipalities.
And in Toronto, that CBA
Yeah,
is a certain number of contracts have to go to social enterprises.
exactly.
So they're getting very creative
Yep.
because they have to deliver on like 6 contracts a year to social enterprises. So they're using couriers,
Yes.
they're using window wash. They're looking at everything they're doing and saying, okay, these things have to be done by the union. This is agreed to.
Yeah.
And that is carved off for the union, and then there's some carved off for
Social
social
economy.
enterprise. And so they have to get creative and
And that's an example, and that was the lady, I think, was the procurement officer for the construction company. And she was talking with, and present was an official from the city of Toronto. So they worked hand in hand, and I found that very refreshing also.
And when you say they, from the town of Toronto.
Yes, from the city. Well, he was not the mayor, but he was a high-level executive of the.
wages, and he's in the procurement office,
This is the procurement
Yes.
office.
responsible for social procurement.
Oh, yeah.
So, but it's in, yeah,
It's very high up in the hierarchy.
and
So
the woman is in charge of all the procurement.
for the construction
for
company.
metro links, yeah.
But the CBA is for infrastructure project, not for the goods and the services.
Yeah, but it is an
No.
infrastructure because they're
Because
building a
it's
metro
construction.
line.
Yes, I understand, but this is the procurement service.
Yes, of the
It's a community
construction.
benefit, it's a community benefit agreement attached to the new light rail. So they have a light rail, they have a metro going in, they
That's
have a big water.
Big
works.
project.
All their infrastructure, if the city's involved, it now has a community benefit agreement.
And it's pretty
That's
interesting.
one of what we're thinking about now,
Yeah.
because we, with our politics on procurement, responsible procurement, it touches more the services and the products, but the procurement office is more managing the higher infrastructure projects. So I said, we don't have an influence on the little exchange or food or services. So this could really change something.
Yeah. It's really a very good way of, I think, presenting a different way of doing things. And we need to get there, I think. Here, we're not there yet. Some of us are, but
But the other thing that happens is because they take a long time,
yeah,
you actually know some years ahead,
yeah,
like that's gonna happen.
So you need-
actually been able, like, then you work with someone like Risk or someone who's
Yes.
doing one of the social enterprise developers.
Yeah.
And you've got the financing here.
Yeah.
So you have all the infrastructure in Quebec.
to put that in place.
To put that in place, if you know 3 years from now, here's a contract, you can take a social enterprise, train them up, get them
Yep.
built, finance them, so one of the advantages you have is you have such amazing social economy infrastructure and ecosystem,
Yeah, we do.
that your ability to respond to some of this is so much greater than other communities,
Mhm.
where they don't have all those tools in place
Exactly.
to respond. And especially because things like this hospital that's being built, it's been in the planning for years and years, right?
Mm.
And there was nothing to trigger them to engage with us until this policy came in and said, when you apply for rezoning, the triggers. Up until now, they said, what a nice idea, we'll call you. And somehow, they never called. But now it's kind of like, because of the public policy, they have to come to the table. But in others, there's one developer who's doing a big project. He voluntarily, it's smaller than the trigger thing, they are voluntarily going to do a community benefit agreement because it's in the inner city. And they just feel responsible as a local developer not to leave the community out. So, and I think they also are learning, it's a good relationship, right?
Yeah.
They want a good,
Yeah. Everybody gets a piece of the cake.
Yeah.
Everybody gets a good advantage and a benefit in different ways.
so, but it does take all those stakeholders, because one of the things we learned, as wonderful as cities are, they don't always understand or need what the community sees. They have what they need and see. So when you get the different, and then you get the developer, and they have their needs. And those three have different angles. So when you get them together, you can come to a more negotiated result that benefits everyone. And for some of the contractors, like having a social enterprise doing the day labor, or the toilets is a really good example. So when they built the casino, they built a big Marriott hotel. It has 400 rooms. Every bathroom is the same. So someone said, how could we use that? Because it's identical work. And so they went to the First Nations employment training thing that works with young people and said, so you train people in the trades and in plumbing, could you train some people to put in these bathrooms? They're all gonna look like this. And they said, okay, we'll train 20 people who will come to the site, and in fact, because we're employment service, we'll subsidize the wages. So of course, the plumbing contractor's like, these guys are like, what? They're gonna subsidize the wages. Oh, okay, that's kind of nice. And I get to oversee it, and you get to oversee it. And you're gonna, so the plumbing contractor was negotiated into it. The First Nations employment training thing thought it was great. And they put all the bathrooms in, and that plumber hired 15 of those young First Nations workers onto his crew. And said, now you have a job. It gave them a chance to prove their quality to the contractor. He would never have taken them from here to there, but with this transition of that negotiated thing, they actually created jobs.
On the other hand, it might be a bit more difficult in the construction industry since it's unionized a lot. And, but they could be a part of the whole process too.
But sometimes
Because that would be important that they participate.
it's also what we found with some of the unions is some of them are having trouble getting youth
Yeah,
into
we're all having the
apprenticeships.
same problem. Yeah.
So what you do is you then support their apprenticeship programs.
Yeah.
On the site and say, okay, what we can do for you as a construction, can we get some employment training for some of your apprenticeships? If you agree to bring them on site, we can go talk to the training groups in the schools to provide the training.
Yeah.
And if it's a big project, it's long enough that they will be, journeymen by the time the project's over.
Yeah.
So for the construction industry, sometimes there's value. The other value we found is there are some things they don't like doing. Like day labor can be really hard, but most of them hire day labor that are not unionized maybe. Or we even had their offices, the trailers, someone had to clean the trailers every day, right? And in Toronto, that has to be a union person. In other communities, it didn't have to be union, so social enterprise that hires people with mental health issues, does cleaning, they clean the trailer. So it's really sitting down and looking at that whole gamut of what you're gonna do. In Glasgow, Scotland, the construction for the Commonwealth Arena, they had to do some community benefits, so they sat down with the developer and said, I don't hire people like that. It can't be, it's not good. And they said, well, what do you do? What else do you do? He said, well, yeah, food trucks. So they had this 3-year big project. So they went to a social enterprise and said, can you do food truck on this? He said, oh, it's too big for us. So they got 3 social enterprises to share 5 days a week of food truck service to the construction site. And they all hired people with disabilities. The biggest problem when they started was the menu. Because the guys on the construction site said, well, where's the fish and where's the chips and where's the curry? And like, you don't want salad?
I'm not gonna get through the day.
So they worked out, and now the owner of that development company so loved the fact, he said, you know what, I can't hire those guys on my site, but I can bring that food truck now to every job I have. And I can create jobs for these individuals with disabilities that I hand you on the site.
Sometimes it's just that they don't have the idea, and once they do, they get implicated and they just do it like that. It's a great example.
He would never have thought about that unless the government had said, no, if you want this contract, you've got to do something social. He's like, I'm building an arena, and then you talk to the community, and the community says, well, we can do this, we can do that. So it really is that. And that's why the stakeholder stuff is so important because.
The interaction between.
And then the measurements become, better. Because everyone knows what you're measuring, because oftentimes construction companies are so concerned about the finances. Like, oh, that's gonna cost me money, but it's not always gonna cost them money. Sometimes it's gonna save them money and get them an advantage on another project.
Jonathan, y a-t-il encore des gens?
Oui, quelques-uns. Toujours pas de questions.
There's no question. Okay, so I think maybe we're going to finish it. S'il n'y a pas de questions en ondes, dernière chance pour poser des questions aux collègues qui sont en ligne.
But they know how to get a hold of you.
Yes, that's true. And you know that you can find the document of Biosocial Network, Biosocial Canada on their site. So merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, David. So
Thank you,
we're
David.
going to finish the panel. Continuer à échanger.
Super interesting.
Yes.
Better comprehension of where you come from, what you do, and by social. It's super.
This is what we do.
No,
That's
it's
why
great.
we work with you guys.
But the CBA orientation from the government of Canada, you see that now Quebec had the obligation to apply that.